Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new, my name is Orlagh, and today I thought I would talk to you a little bit about the pros and cons of moving abroad or to another country that is not the country you were born to. So if you've never been to my channel before, I've lived previously in China for about a year and a half, in Russia, in Moscow for about 3 years, and I'm living in Madrid in Spain now, and I've lived here for about 7 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the advantages of living in a different country and the disadvantages. So if this sounds interesting to you, then stay tuned. Okay, we have a visitor, my little clingy, very clingy boy. Okay, so we're going to start with one of the pros. I think one of the biggest pros about living in another country that isn't the country you were born in is that it completely changes you in ways that I don't think is completely possible if you stay in the same country your whole life. Because it's impossible not to change you, whether it's becoming more open-minded, learning more about other cultures. It really tests your comfort zone, and it kind of pushes you and pushes your boundaries and kind of makes you a stronger person, I think. You know, you have to become more adaptable, more flexible, you're going to have to learn different ways of living, and I think that that really helps you to improve as a person, and it helps you to mature and realise that you and your worldview, or you and your country's worldview, isn't the same as other countries in the world, and it really makes you realise you're just like a grain of sand on a beach. And I think it's very sobering, but in the best kind of way, where it just challenges you and kind of causes you to grow. So that's one massive advantage of living in a different country, and I can honestly say I'm a completely different person. Obviously everybody changes in their lives, but I'm definitely a completely different person than I was, say, 10 years ago before I lived in different countries, and I don't necessarily think I would have changed as much had I stayed in Wales, which is the country I was born in. So travelling is brilliant, and I do love to travel to other countries, but I really don't think you can kind of get to know a place until you live there for a certain amount of time. You know, there's the tourist experience, and then there's the real experience of living like a local, learning the language, learning the day-to-day cultural differences, the routines, the different ways of life, and you know, that obviously can be challenging, but it really is such an advantage that you just don't get just by travelling somewhere. You know, spending 2-3 weeks in a place as opposed to 2 to 3 months or 2 to 3 years, you're going to get a really different experience. So if you're looking to really kind of immerse yourself in a new culture or a new way of living, then I definitely think living in that country is the best way to do it. So it really allows you to start fresh. Maybe you're bored with your life, you feel like you're stuck in a little bit of a rut, you don't know what you want to do, maybe the things other people are doing aren't the things you want to be doing, and moving to another country really forces you to start fresh because you're in a new country with a new language most of the time. You need to find new friends, a new job, new local places to hang out, a new routine, and if you're looking for that kind of kick up the bum or that like new lease of life, then I really do think moving to another country is one of the best ways to do it. It's one of the most drastic ways to do it, but it's definitely a way to start afresh and feel like, you know, you can kind of have a second chance and a new way of living, which maybe you wouldn't have had if you'd stayed in the same place you're from, or even if you moved to a different city. You know, it's very, very different, and especially if there's a language difference, it really forces you out of that comfort zone and, you know, makes you able to have a fresh new start. And everything feels brand new again, you know, new food, new experiences, new language, new people, and it kind of gives you that spark of life back a little bit that maybe potentially you could have been lacking before. And a great quote that kind of summarises that really well is by Bill Bryson. I can't think of anything that excites a greater sense of childlike wonder than to be in a country where you are ignorant of almost everything. Suddenly you are 5 years old again. You can't read anything, you have only the most rudimentary sense of how things work, you can't even reliably cross a street without endangering your life. Your whole existence becomes a series of interesting guesses. And that's such a great way to summarise it, especially the crossing the road thing. Because really, like, traffic lights are very different in a lot of countries, so like how much time you get to cross the road, it's a thing. I think living in another country really pushes you and focuses you on trying to build a life that you really want to live. You know, instead of just following the status quo, which isn't a bad thing, but maybe if that's not for you, instead of just like falling into the typical go to university, find a job, get engaged, buy a house, have children. Like, if that isn't something, of course you can do those things in a new country, and a lot of my friends here are people who've moved to Spain and have found partners and had kids and built a life here. Of course that's an option, but it means that you can really actively plan the life you want instead of just falling into the kind of routine of what everyone else is doing. And I think sometimes that is good, that you can step outside of that box and go, maybe that is what I want, but maybe it's also not what I want. So how can I build my life around me in a way that gives me joy and gives me purpose without just falling into the same trap as everyone else? And because of that, it also forces you to find friends and new friends at this stage in your life, because often if you live in the country that you were kind of born in and brought and raised into, then maybe you're still with friends from the past who you wouldn't necessarily be friends with now. So moving to another place kind of forces you to recognize the person you are now as opposed to the person you were in the past, and then you can find things you enjoy that then correlate more with who you are now, and that includes, you know, friend groups too. And lastly, learning another language. You know, you're never going to get more of a great chance to learn a language than if you are immersed in that country itself. And that obviously then can feed into career and job opportunities, and there's definitely job opportunities I've had from living in different countries that I never would have had before hadn't I moved around and, you know, taken kind of the opportunities when they were presented to me. So it's a great way in that way of like networking and improving your skills, and also making friends from all around the world. You know, there's still people I'm in contact with from Russia, from China, even now I live in Spain. So it's a great way to meet lots of new people with lots of different experiences. Okay, so moving on to the cons. One of the biggest ones definitely has to be that, you know, you are not going to see your family as much as you would maybe like, and that you miss out on a lot of big life events. So for me, for example, you know, if you have nieces or nephews, you're not going to be able to see them grow up gradually. You know, maybe you'll see them once or twice a year. Lots of life events like birthdays of the people who you care about back home, you're not going to be able to celebrate in the same way. The same for things like weddings. You know, there's been a lot of weddings I've been invited to where just logistically I haven't been able to go because of you know, flight tickets, hotels, accommodation, and that's before you even think about an outfit and a wedding present and things like that. And especially if you're only invited to the night do, and you're not invited to the whole day, you know, you're talking about a day and a half of travel for maybe like 5 hours of a party, and sometimes that's feasible and it works out money wise for you, but a lot of the times it doesn't. So things like that, you know, you are going to miss out on, and it does depend how close you are to your family. You know, if you're very, very close to your family, that's going to be more difficult for you, but maybe if you're not and you don't have that kind of support system in the city or country you're already from, it might not be such a big of a deal, but it's definitely something to consider. And even with FaceTime, it's really hard to keep those connections at home alive and thriving. You know, when you can't pop around to your best friend's house for a quick cup of tea before you go out to work, or does anyone do that? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like before work, I would not be up that early, you know, pop in to see your family. So these connections take a lot more work, and you know, sometimes some people aren't willing to put in the work on their side, which means that then in turn you're kind of working more for that, and that tends with family and friends, you know, that can end up causing those relationships to maybe not be as strong as they would be if you were in the country that you are born into or that you live in. So that's something to consider. Like obviously it's brilliant that we have, you know, FaceTime and WhatsApp calls and things like that, but obviously they're no real substitute. I think the pandemic showed how many people, you know, with all the Zoom classes and stuff and Zoom dates, that it isn't really a substitute for proper contact. So it does mean that relationships you have back home can be harder to maintain. But then with that, often there are those friendships where when you come back and you see that person, everything clicks to just like it was before, which is the best thing ever. So in terms of holidays and traveling, this will obviously depend on your income and how much time you can get off work, but you know, often what tends to happen with me is that the money I would normally be saving to go on a holiday that year ends up going towards going back home to visit family and friends. And obviously while that's really amazing, you know, it is very busy. You're going from one house to the other, you're seeing a lot of people in a very short, intense space of time, which can be very emotional too if you're spending like 2 weeks with somebody you don't normally see, and then, You know, it's like a little bit too much in one go almost sometimes. So what tends to happen is the money then that maybe normally would be for a 2-week holiday on the beach somewhere ends up going on your return trip home, and that kind of can't be helped often, you know, if you're not in a financial situation that you can afford to do both of those things. But especially if you're thinking of moving further away, like when I lived in China, for example, the price of a long haul flight, you know, it's something to consider. Maybe the job you're with will offer some kind of remuneration package, but most people I know don't have anything like that. So yeah, definitely something to consider when you think about how you're going to budget your weeks off, on how you're going to budget your money and time, especially with your time off work. And obviously visiting family is lovely, but ideally you'd see them and have 2 weeks in the sun, as opposed to just, you know, having a really kind of rushed visit as your holiday. Another con, and again this depends on your job, but you don't necessarily have the same career path as you would do in your native country. You know, it's not necessarily the same as everybody who are buying houses and saving in their pensions. You know, a lot of people I know who live and work here and in the countries I've lived in previously don't necessarily have that same structure as a lot of people back home. So that's definitely something to consider and think about, because it's definitely a different way of living often. And again, this depends on your job. You know, maybe you will have those pension plans, but you know, it depends on the country you're moving to and the way in which they work. And linked into that, you might notice I keep saying back home. At this point in my life, I consider Spain my home, to be honest, and I'm very happy living here, and I don't have any plans to move anywhere else anytime soon. But there is always this weird feeling when you live in another country that you kind of have 2 homes, but also 0 homes at the same time. It's strange. Like when I'm here in Spain, I refer to the UK as home, but when I go back to the UK, I'll say, oh, when I get back home, meaning Spain. It reminds me of a quote. It's a funny thing about coming home. It looks the same, smells the same, feels the same. You'll realise what's changed is you. And yeah, I think that's very true, that living in different places, you know, it gives you this strange feeling of having 2 homes, which isn't always a bad thing. It's actually great. And it reminds me of another quote, which I'll read to you, that I really like, by Miriam Adini. Part of your heart always will be elsewhere. That is the price you pay for the richness of loving and knowing people in more than one place. Which is, you know, really lovely and really true. And, you know, a big con is being homesick often and missing out on your home comforts, and, you know, getting really excited when you find a jar of Marmite in the supermarket, or, you know, whatever your equivalent home comfort is, or crumpets. Ooh, love a crumpet. So yeah, you do have this weird dichotomy of kind of being too foreign for this place, but also not quite the same as you were before. And I guess that's just something that happens when you move to a different country, but, you know, it's not a con that outweighs any of the positives by any nature, but it's definitely something to consider. And lastly, in terms of ease, sometimes just because maybe of cultural differences or language differences, everyday things that maybe in your home country would be easier can become more difficult, whether it's having to go to the doctor and explain in your quite okay Spanish but not medical grade level what's wrong with you, or whether it's going to the bank, or whether you want to start thinking about how to apply for a mortgage in a different country. Things like that obviously become more difficult when it isn't your native tongue, and that's why learning the language is so important. But even sometimes different culture shocks. I have a whole video about the differences in culture between the UK and Spain, which I'll link here, that you can feel free to watch after this video. But things that seem easy for native born people in the country that you're living in my case native Spaniards, it's always going to be slightly easier for them than it is for me, just because of the way they're used to the system. They're of this country and I'm just a visitor, or a liverer. A liverer? Thinking of like a weird liver now. But yeah, in this country. So sometimes, and this was even more so in China, for example, and in Russia, I think because we're in Europe here, it's slightly easier than living in those 2 places. Which, by the way, I have a video, it's quite an old video now, but of what life was like living in China, that I'll also link here. And I'm going to make one about how life was living in Moscow too. So yeah, those are some of the pros and cons of living in a different country. If you're looking for some kind of sign, my opinion is 110% go for it. Living in different countries has absolutely changed my life for the better. I've become such an adaptable, strong, resourceful person because of it, because I've had to be, and I've had some of the best experiences of my life living in different countries. And a quote that I'm going to leave you with, because I think this is just so lovely, and it's this one by Seth Godin. Instead of wondering when your next vacation is, maybe you should set up a life you don't need to escape from. And I know that's easier said than done, and obviously that requires resources and some level of, like, you know, privilege and time to be able to set yourself up in a new country. But if you have the opportunity, I think it's definitely something that you should do. I think everybody should live in a different country for a while, if not just to kind of like humble yourself to the fact that you aren't and your country is at the centre of the universe. So it's definitely something I recommend. And if you have any questions about life in Spain or anything else, let me know in the comments box down below. And an extra lovely quote to leave you with is by George Carlin, and he says, "Everyone smiles in the same language." And that's really true. Like, sometimes a smile goes a really long way, unless culturally they don't smile that often, which in that case can be a little bit weird. But yeah, let's not worry about that. Thank you very much for watching. My little doggy is asleep on my leg here, which is why I've been randomly stroking it, in case you're wondering what that was. But yeah, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again around these spots soon. Thank you very much. Bye.